Now, one of the countries that we have been trying to cultivate over the last 13 years was an enemy that was regarded as our fiercest enemy. That country is Russia. And in fact, we fought a war with Russia, sometimes hot and sometimes cold, for over 50 years. And finally, in 1991, the communist system collapsed. And out of it came the opportunity of creating better relations. All right? And in fact, we started with Yeltsin, and then Yeltsin was succeeded by this man, Putin. And Russia occupies a vast territory, a strategic place in the world. It also possesses enormous amounts of energies that we need for our industrial world, that both we and our allies are dependent on. And it would be, given our war with parts of the Muslim world, it would be tragic if indeed a new hostility arose between us and Russia. Only recently there has been a kind of reconciliation. The United States of America had been angry at the Russians because they had provided materiel for Saddam Hussein. But then came the terrible tragedy in Chechnya. Do you remember? The children, the ones who died, the terrorists took over the school in Beslan, and Putin now says, we're at war with that fundamentalist Muslim world. Well, that's exactly what George Bush Jr. says. So George and Putin got together, and now it was sort of lovey-dovey. And that was in particular important because the United States of America was having trouble with many of its European allies. And this was seen as a victory until November came around. In November, an election was held. Most people in the world didn't know this election was going to take place. Most people reading a newspaper, seeing the word Ukraine, turn. They don't read. I mean, there's no interest. It's some kind of obscure country that was part of the Soviet Union. I mean, you don't read. But this election captured the headlines. For days, it was on the front page of the New York Times and other major newspapers, and even the Detroit Free Press and the Detroit News. There it was. This election captured the imagination and attention of the world. What was happening was there were two candidates left over from an earlier election that had been held in October, and the two leading candidates, neither of whom had achieved a majority, were now going to have a runoff. And it was November the 21st. On the one side was the man who represented the existing government. For 10 years, the Ukraine had had a president. His name was Leonid Kuchma. And he could not, after 10 years, serve anymore because the Constitution forbade serving more than 2 terms, and each of the terms is 5 years. And so he had chosen or designated his prime minister, a man by the name of Yanukovych, to be his successor. The assumption would be that Yanukovych would continue the policies and programs of Kuchma. On the other side was a man called Yushchenko. Yushchenko had been a prime minister for Kuchma, and then had been driven from office by the president. And it turned into the leader of the opposition in the Ukraine. And he now stood against Yanukovych. Their constituencies were found basically in different parts of the Ukraine. Yanukovych's constituency was in the eastern Ukraine, and Yushchenko's constituency was mainly in the western Ukraine and partly in the center of the Ukraine. Exit polls indicated that Yushchenko was the victor by a margin of at least 5 to 6%. But when the results were announced by the government, Yanukovych was declared the winner. And there had been observers of the election, and it was very, very clear that there had been a lot of hanky-panky going on. And then something very surprising happened, because the people in the Ukraine have been known to be passively accepting of almost any dictatorial regime that showed up. It was simply assumed that they would accept the decision of the government, even though the election may have been taken from the true victor. Now, it was very clear from the beginning. Putin himself had come to the Ukraine, and Kuchma himself had gone to Moscow. It was very clear that Putin backed Kuchma and backed Yanukovych, that Russia was behind Yanukovych. And it was very clear that in Putin's mind, the Ukraine belonged in the Russian sphere of influence. And Yanukovych would guarantee that the Ukraine remained in the Russian sphere of influence, because the Ukraine had been for centuries part of the Russian Empire. It belonged to the Russians. And even though the Soviet Union no longer existed, and even though the Soviet Union had lost Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Poland and Romania and whatever, and they'd all joined Europe, under no circumstances would Putin and the Russians allow the Ukraine to elect a man who would say, as Yushchenko said in the election, it's about time that we shift our allegiance from the Russians to the West. Now, something surprising happened. Just north of the Ukraine, there is a country. I will use my finger. If you don't see it, I'll try to describe it to you. All right. North of the Ukraine is a so-called independent country called Belarus. Belarus means White Russia. The White Russians, or the Belarusians, have a language that is distinct from Russian, and they were always a republic, a special republic in the Soviet Union. Today they are governed by a communist dictator. His name is Lukashenko, and he recently held an election in which he won over 90% of the vote. The opposition had no access to the media. Their leaders were arrested. It's a terrible place if you're interested in democracy. And of course, Lukashenko was backed by Putin because he believes that Belarus belongs basically in the Russian system, and Lukashenko wants Belarus in the Russian system. And in fact, nobody in Belarus, Minsk is the capital. Minsk and Pinsk are both in Belarus, in case you're interested. Okay. In Minsk, the capital, no demonstrations. Do you want it? Nobody. I've been to Belarus. This is a very passive, intimidated population, enduring a regime that is very similar to the old regime under the Soviet Union. No protest there were a few demonstrations, and in fact, Lukashenko brought out his police and canceled them out. On the other side of Russia is a country that formerly belonged to the Soviet Union, filled with oil and natural gas. The name of that country is Kazakhstan. Almost 1/2 of the people in Kazakhstan are Russian. And they have a dictator by the name of Nazarbayev. He holds elections from time to time. He recently held an election. He also gets like over 90% of the people love him and adore him, and he wins the election. Putin and the Russians regard Kazakhstan as part of the Russian sphere. The Soviet Union may no longer exist, but what? Kazakhstan, with all its Russians, belongs to Russia. And Nazarbayev is willing to cooperate. In fact, Putin was about, after the Ukrainian election, to celebrate the union of Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and the Ukraine, a kind of counter-union to the European Union. And he was hoping for American cooperation. After all, aren't they both fighting the Muslim terrorists? But what happened in Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine, was unexpected. Yushchenko and his chief aide, she is a very dynamic woman of great courage, who was imprisoned under the most difficult circumstances under the Kuchma regime. Her name is Tymoshenko. And both Yushchenko and Tymoshenko brought out, the estimates are not clear, at one point close to 200,000 people, do you understand? In a country which had no record of public demonstrations. They came into the square. They came from all over the Ukraine. They made their way to Kiev, and they stood in front of the presidential palace. Placard, did you see the pictures? Demanding that the results that were announced be canceled, and that another election, either the true results be published or maybe another election be held under international supervision, whatever it be. And in fact, Yushchenko and Tymoshenko arrive and they stand before the crowd and they're being cheered. Now in Belarus, Lukashenko brought out his troops. And in a few minutes, whoever was there was what? Dispersed. Kuchma, who is still the president, obviously, until they inaugurate Yanukovych, Kuchma called out his troops and then decided not to use them. You might be able to shoot at 2,000 or 3,000, but you're not going to shoot at, what are you talking about? I mean, they'll tear down 200,000. You can't. And so the mob, if you want to call them that, the group stayed, and they vowed they would not leave until they got what they wanted. So Kuchma and Yanukovych now consult. They talk to Putin. Putin from Moscow now says something that is unpleasant about the Americans. He says they are responsible for this trouble. An election was held, there was a victor. And the reason why those demonstrators are there is that American agents have come into the Ukraine and stirred up trouble and brought those people there. So now you can just feel the friction. I mean, not friendship, but enormous hostility. This demonstration is striking at the heart of Putin's ambitions. He's already been struggling with the embarrassment he suffered with the terrorist acts in Beslan in Chechnya. He was counting on the cooperation of the United States of America. This is our sphere of influence. The Ukraine belongs to us. It has belonged to us for centuries. We're not asking for Germany. We're not asking for Poland. So even if there was a little crooked stuff, it's ours. Don't you want an alliance with us? And the same challenge was issued to the Europeans. But the mob stayed. And in fact, there was another provocation, overwhelming. Yushchenko was one of the handsomest men in the Ukraine. Was. If you see pictures of him prior to September of 2004, I mean, he's a very, very handsome man. But the Yushchenko who stood up confronting the group looked like an old man, and his face, the skin, was all distorted. I mean, and there were like boils and pockmarks and everything hideous. What had happened? Well, he claimed that he had gone, that he was invited to a dinner by the head of intelligence and the Secret Service, Smechkov, in Kiev, late at night, and that he got home and fell ill, so ill they had to send him to Vienna to the hospital. Later on, they would confirm that he was poisoned by being given a dose of dioxin. It's one of those products of industrial pollution that can kill you. If you get it in small doses, it'll kill you slowly. But if you get it in big doses all at once, it will just kill you. They assumed that it would kill him. And the result was the disfigurement of his face represented the government. So, the mob was angry, the crowd was angry, and they weren't prepared to go. And the United States of America made a choice. They supported the crowd. And so did most of the European powers. They supported the crowd. And now the demand was there, and the next thing that happened. It is generally the case in the Soviet system and in what we call the legacy of the Soviet system that the judges are party hacks. They do what the government wants them to do. It was assumed that if you appealed to the Ukrainian Supreme Court, who were basically what? Appointees of Kuchma, that the Ukrainian Supreme Court would just say, oh, Yanukovych won. Wrong. The Ukrainian Supreme Court could see what was happening. There were 200,000 people, and they weren't going to go away. And whatever this court was politically before, they could see the handwriting on the wall. And they declared the election null and void, filled with corruption, and ordered a new election, not starting from scratch, but a new election for the runoff. Now that election was held on December the 26th. And in that election, which had international observers, Yushchenko emerged as the clear victor. When everything was finished, he had somewhere around 52% of the vote. And Yanukovych had about 45% of the vote. I mean, it's a fairly clear majority established. And now Yanukovych makes an appeal, but it's useless to the Supreme Court to just throw it out. And in fact, Yushchenko will be inaugurated as the next president of the Ukraine, a man who knows he was poisoned. Imagine, poisoned by the previous government. And something has happened in the Soviet world. For the first time, one of the legacy states of the Soviet world, Slavic states, has embraced what we would call the strength of democratic sentiment. The people will not accept a regime illegally elected. And now there are all the questions. The questions are, what will happen to the Ukraine? Will it join the West? In fact, the government of Poland would like to see the Ukraine join the European Union. For it to join the European Union is to break centuries of tradition where the Ukraine was allied with Russia. Will it be intimidated ultimately by Putin, who sends natural gas and oil to the Ukraine, to return to the fold? And will the United States of America provide aid to the new Ukraine, provoking the Russians in the process? So the Ukraine stands right in the center of a potential new Cold War. Right there. So in order to give you a certain perspective, let me tell you the story of the Ukraine as briefly as I can, and I will do it by talking about the ingredients that go into the making of the Ukraine, all right? Because throughout the centuries, there it is. First, let me try to describe what the Ukraine is presently. Theoretically, you're never supposed to say the Ukraine, because we don't say the England, the France, the Spain. So you're supposed to say just Ukraine. But everybody says the Ukraine because historically the word Ukraine meant the border. So you said the Ukraine, the border, because it was on the border of Russia. So I will continue to say the. So the Ukraine is the size of the state of Texas. It's a territory somewhere around 250,000 square miles. It's the size of the state of Texas. It has more people than Texas. It has 50 million people. In the Ukraine, 73% are Ukrainians. Only 73%. In Poland, for instance, 98% of the people are Polish. Only 73% of the people in the Ukraine are Ukrainian. 22% of the people in the Ukraine are Russian. Most of the Russians are in the eastern part of the Ukraine, and most of the Ukrainians are in the center and in the west. Ukraine is in a very important place. One of the reasons why the Russians took it and wanted it and conquered it was it's on the Black Sea. Otherwise, the vast territory of Russia is stuck with the Arctic Ocean. It provided the Russian Empire with a warm water port. It's called the Black Sea. And on the Black Sea were stationed the largest parts of the Russian Navy, especially around a place, a little peninsula that sticks out of the Ukraine that was visited by Errol Flynn, called the Crimea. All right. So you may have seen the charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. All right. So there it is. So it's on the Black Sea, and through it flows the most important, one of the two important rivers of Russia. The first, the one we all know from the song, the Volga, all right, which empties out into what is called the Caspian Sea. The other, which historically is more important in terms of Russian history, is the Dnieper, D-N-E-P-R, and it starts up somewhere near St. Petersburg and flows directly south and empties out, comes through the Ukraine. Now, because there are many small rivers that empty, at the mouths of all these rivers, these deltas emerged. So the southern part of the Ukraine contains the best mud in the world. You can see it. It's called black earth. For miles and miles, you can just see it. You can grow anything. Do you understand? Even people don't know how to grow. You can't not grow. It's the best land for farming. And in fact, Russia didn't have very good land for farming until it conquered the Ukraine, because the Ukraine became the granary of the Soviet Union. So good was the land. Now, the first thing to throw into what I call the ingredient are the Slavic peoples. The Slavic peoples arose somewhere in what I call the Middle Dnieper. And somewhere around 2,000 years ago, they moved and they headed south. Where they lived in the Middle Dnieper was woodland. And they moved out of the woodland into what today is the Ukraine, the southern part of the river, which isn't a woodland, which is a prairie. The word for prairie in Russian is steppe. It's called the steppes, right? It's just open, flat land, a part of which is enormously fertile, and they moved down into the area, and they lived along the Dnieper River. Second ingredient, the Swedes. Somewhere around 800 A.D., the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Danes had turned into something called the Vikings. And they went on a rampage. The Norwegians and Danes invaded Western Europe and assaulted it, including England and France and Italy and whatever. And the Eastern Vikings, who were called the Swedes, headed across the Baltic Sea and came down the Dnieper. And they plundered, they conquered, and they conquered most of the Eastern Slavs that were on the Dnieper. They established forts. They began to engage in trade, transporting the goods of the woodland all the way down to the Black Sea, and then they would sail to Constantinople where they'd sell it. Along the way, these little forts turned into towns and cities, and the Vikings became an aristocracy. The people beneath them were the Slavs, and the people who ruled the Slavs were the Vikings. The name of the Vikings were the Rus. And so the whole collection of forts and towns along that river was called Russia, or Russia. That's where the name Russia comes from. Ultimately, because the Vikings were few in number and the Slavs were large in number, the Vikings stopped speaking Swedish or Viking and began to speak Slavic, or what came to be called Russian. By the time we get to the 10th century AD, comes the third ingredient. The third ingredient is something called Russia. One of the Viking rulers, whose name is Rurik, establishes a dynasty. His sons and grandsons become the rulers of most of the towns, which are then federated into something that we would call a state, called Russia. And in the 10th century, there now emerges along the Dnieper a huge state. The ruler of the state doesn't call himself king. His headquarters is in one of the towns on the Dnieper, which is now the capital of the Ukraine. It's called Kiev. And he's called the Grand Prince of Kiev, and also the ruler of all, it's always called, all the Russias. And in fact, it grows very, very rich and powerful. So powerful that in the 11th century, the King of France sends one of his daughters to marry, all the way across Europe, to marry the son of the Grand Prince of Kiev. It is, so there's a state, and it's called Russia. So, and this is part of the historic thinking. Kiev, which is now the capital of the Ukraine, started out as the first capital of Russia before Moscow ever existed. Kiev was the capital of Russia. And in the Russian mind, that's why they think of the Ukraine as what? I mean, as Russian, this is where Russia began. The fourth ingredient is called Christianity. At the end of the 10th century, the Grand Prince of Kiev, the Vikings took a long time to become Christian. They waited a long time. They were having a good time plundering. So they finally got to it. At the end of the 10th century, about 1,000 years ago, the Grand Prince of Kiev decided to enter what he would call the community of nations in Europe by signing up for Christianity. He had two choices. He could either become a Catholic or he could become Orthodox. For two reasons, he chose Orthodoxy. One, the Germans, who were his enemy to the West, were Catholic. And also the Poles were Catholic. And the second reason was that most of his trade was with Constantinople. So all of it was reinforced by a princess of the emperor, of the Greek emperor in Constantinople, now arriving in Kiev, and she now became, you understand, the wife of the Grand Prince. And now there arrived this religion, which was a very important part of the history of the Russian people. It ultimately would become the Russian Orthodox Church. The strength of the church lay not in bishops, in dioceses, it lay in monasteries, which were built all over the area. If you go to Russia, if you go to the Ukraine, you'll see them. There's all these enormous monasteries, which were the centers of learning and culture, because the only people who could read and write were the monks. And it became a very powerful part of Russian culture. So again, I have to emphasize, when Russia began, Russia was in the Ukraine. Well, the next ingredient are called the Mongols. They are the people who will create the Ukrainians. The Mongols were a people who started out in Eastern Asia and conquered the largest land empire the world had ever seen. That land empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean all the way to Europe, and in fact, in the 13th century, somewhere around 1225, the Mongol armies entered into Europe, and of course the first place they would enter into would be what? Russia. There it was, and they conquered Russia. And they moved from Russia westward into Germany. But then they turned back. The great Khan, who was the Khan of the Mongols, died, and an election had to be held. And so the leader of the army, who was one of his sons, had to turn back, and he might want to be the great Khan, right? So they stopped in Germany, but they kept Russia. And Russia now falls under the control of the Mongols. However, this is a very unstable frontier. And in the 14th century, the two European powers right next to the Mongols, just to the west of the Russians, attack Mongol territory, and they take part of it. They take half of Russia. So the eastern part of Russia, and you can see that by the present boundaries. The eastern part of Russia, which is in yellow, right, remains in the hands of the Mongols. The western part of Russia, which is in orange and purple, remains in the hands of two nations on the west. Let me give you their names. One is called the Poles, and the other is a small nation with an incredible military aristocracy. They were called the Lithuanians. In fact, the Lithuanians were the major power that defeated the Mongols. They took what today is Belarus, and they took most of what today is the Ukraine, including Kiev. At the end of the 14th century, the Poles and Lithuanians merged into a single kingdom. And as time went on, the Lithuanians lost much of their power in that kingdom. The main power was in the hands of the Poles. So now the Russians are divided. Part of the Russians live under the Mongols. The Russians who live under the Mongols begin to organize against the Mongols under the leadership of a new city. That new city is called Moscow. And Moscow now becomes the center of the resistance. In time, the people of Moscow, the Grand Prince of Moscow, will lead a rebellion against the Mongols, and Russia, or East Russia, will become independent. For many years, what today we call Russia was simply called Muscovy. It was named after Moscow. But Western Russia remains in the hands of the Poles and Lithuanians. So it's like West Germany and what? East Germany, got it? North Korea and South Korea. If you extend that over centuries, what happens is the West Russians turn into a separate nation. The East Russians are the what? The Russians, the Great Russians. The West Russians get a name which in Latin, after all the Poles were Catholic and they used Latin, the name is Ruthenian, you'll hear. Ruthenians. And the Ruthenians developed a language all their own, meaning it was Russian, but it was Russian spoken in what? A different way. In fact, it's the basis, Ruthenian is the basis of what today we call Ukrainian. For instance, they had a vowel change. In Russian you would say Alexander, but you would say Alexander in Ukrainian. We have the same change, like the word war. We spell it W-A-R, but we don't pronounce it war. The ah turns into a what? An auth, like wall. We spell it W-A-L-L, but we pronounce the A as a what? As an aw. The other thing was the sound G, G, becomes Ch. So where you would say Gospodin, like man or Lord, you say Chospadin. I mean, you change. The sounds, and after a while, with enough changes, right? What used to be the same language turns into a distinct and other language because the West Russians have no contact with the East Russians. They're under two different administrations. And the West Russians are divided into two parts, the Ruthenians. The North Ruthenians are controlled by the Lithuanians. They will ultimately turn into what we call the White Russians. And the South Ruthenians will be controlled by the Poles. And they will turn into what ultimately we call the Ukrainians. Now, the next ingredient that you have to throw into this whole picture is called the Turks. The Turks started out first in Turkestan, then they came to what today is Turkey, then they captured Constantinople in 1453, and then they went on a rampage, taking the whole, conquering Greece, taking the Balkans, coming to the gates of Vienna, the whole thing, and they wanted to turn the Black Sea into a Turkish lake. So they now invade the area of the West Russians under the control of the Poles. And they take the whole northern shore of the Black Sea. So now there is a frontier where these Ruthenians are. There's a frontier between them and the Turks, which is a kind of no man's land because they're very afraid of the Turks. So what you have is the Turks are over here, then there's a whole bunch of what? Space, right? And then comes the Ruthenians. Now that space was to be very important. You have to understand that when the Poles and Lithuanians took over from the Russians, there was now a class structure. It had three parts. At the bottom were the Ruthenians. They were the what? The peasants. They did all the hard work. The rulers, who were the Poles and Lithuanians, were Catholic. The Ruthenians were Orthodox. And they couldn't get into their church because the keys to their church was held by the Lord. Do you understand? The Lord of the manor. In the middle were a group of people who had come all the way from Germany and had moved into Poland. And when Poland and Lithuania took West Russia, they just moved into the Ruthenian territory because they were the middle class. They're called the Jews. Thousands and thousands and thousands of them. They went to Minsk and Pinsk and Kiev, and they went there, and they were in the middle. There was the landlord who rode horses. There was the Jew who managed the estate for him. And then there were the what? Ruthenians, who were at the bottom. Now, one of the names given to the South Ruthenians was Ukrainian. Why? Because they were on the Ukraine, which is the what? The frontier. They were the border, got it? The border people. So after a while, people referred to them not simply as Ruthenian, but they referred to them as what? Ukrainian. And after a while, the name was to stick. They were the border people, but they were the same people as the Ruthenians, as the West Russians. And as time went on, their dialect began to differ more and more and more and more from the dialect that was used in Moscow. So that ultimately you might describe it as a distinct and different language. Now, this no man's land was interesting because many of the Ukrainian peasants hated their Polish and Lithuanian overlords and hated the Jewish managers. So sometimes they would escape. Where could they go? Well, they fled south into the what? Into the no man's land that lay between the Ruthenia and the Turks. There they met Turks. Sometimes they intermarried with them, whatever it was. They picked up the lifestyle of what we would call gauchos. They learned horsemanship from the Turks, and they didn't belong to the Turks, and they weren't under the control of the Polish government, and they were given a name which is a Turkish name, Kazakh. The name, another way of saying Kazakh, is Kazakh. Right? So they were the best horsemen around. They were untamable, do you understand? Uncontrollable, whatever it is, but there they were in large numbers, and living at the mouth of the Dnieper River in this no man's land, they spoke Ukrainian. They were Ukrainian, and they were not fully controlled by the Polish government, which is to lead to the next ingredient. In the 17th century, the peasants, the Ruthenian, the Ukrainian peasants, living under Polish control, were so oppressed that they rose up in a rebellion. The year is 1648. It was about the time that King Charles of England lost his head, was cut off. Okay. The Puritans. And in 1648, they had a leader, a Cossack leader, who was played by Yul Brynner in a rather mediocre movie. The name of the hero and the leader was Khmelnytsky. And Khmelnytsky is basically the first, do you understand? Because up until that time, the Ukrainians as a nation are simply what? They're just emerging. Ukrainian as a kind of concept took a while to emerge, and in the 17th century it emerges. Khmelnytsky leads a major rebellion against the Poles. In order to do this rebellion, he needs help. The only people he can turn to are the people who share his religion. They are the Russians. And the Russians help him, and in his rebellion, he kills 100,000 Poles and 100,000 Jews. And in fact, devastates the whole economy. When it's over, the Ukrainians do not win independence. They have not yet developed a strong enough sense of what we call nation. They are, or part of the Ukraine, is now annexed by Russia. So now the next ingredient is fairly clear. The Russians are on a roll. The Poles are now weakened by that rebellion. And now the Russians acquire two great rulers. One ruler is later on called Peter the Great, and the other ruler is called Catherine the Great. And their great aim is to find a warm water port for Russia. The only place to get it is the Black Sea. So both Peter the Great and Catherine the Great will come down here. They will fight the Turks, they will defeat the Turks, and they will take a large part of the Ukraine. In fact, between 1772 and 1795, Catherine the Great will invade Poland 3 times. And by 1795, Poland will cease to exist, and all of West Russia, all of the Ruthenians, all of the Ukrainians now fall under the control of the Russians. But when Catherine the Great gets them, they're no longer Russian, they're now what? They've been transformed. They're now Ukrainians. And the no man's land, Catherine the Great decides to build a great city, a great port on the Black Sea at the end of the 18th century. A city that's younger than Detroit, because Detroit was founded at the beginning of the 18th century. The name of that city, named after a Greek hero, Odysseus, Ulysses, is Odessa. And Odessa becomes the great port of the Russians on the Black Sea. And to fill it up, Catherine the Great doesn't invite Ukrainian peasants. She invites Russians, Germans, and Jews who come all the way from Austria. And in fact, what happens is the southern coast is now filled with Russian-speaking people. So what is happening is that with the conquest of the Ukraine, the Russians start sending Russians into the territory. In fact, the Ukraine becomes, if you want, the Florida of Russia. Because the southernmost part of Russia is here in a peninsula that hangs off of the Ukraine called the Crimea. And it's there that you have wonderful resorts like Yalta and whatever. Like the Tsar would have his what? His summer palace down there, or winter palace down there in Yalta. So, the Ukraine falls under the control of the Russians. Not fully until 1795, and when the Russians get the Ukrainians. They don't remember that they were Russians. They have been transformed. Their language is different. In fact, when they were living under the Poles, many of them were converted to Roman Catholicism. So now there are 2 Ukrainian churches. There's a Ukrainian Orthodox, right? And there is a Ukrainian Catholic. Well, the next ingredient is called nationalism. We're now talking about the 19th century. In the 19th century, ideas arrive from Western Europe. They cross all the way through the center and they finally reach it. There are two ideas that came out of the French Revolution. One is the idea of enlightenment, the idea of education. What flows from that is the creation of schools and the teaching of literacy. All right. Now, the way you make people aware of a language is that what? They learn to read, right? To read and write it. So now thousands and thousands of people for whom Ukrainian is only a what? A spoken language. Now Ukrainian turns into a real language. And all of that is reinforced by the emergence of Ukrainian literature. So now let me tell you about the Shakespeare of Ukrainian. I mean, he is the great. I mean, if you go to a Ukrainian school, his picture is everywhere. His name is Shevchenko. And Shevchenko wrote poetry and he wrote stories and whatever. I mean, a very, very powerful writer. And he hated the Russians. He hated the Russians in particular because the Russians kept telling the Ukrainians, "You're Russians." Don't you understand? That's how you started out. You're Russians. Don't you know who you are? That's who you are. So why don't you speak Russian the right way? So the Russians now try to force the Ukrainians to what? To speak Russian the way Russian is spoken in Moscow. So there is this whole campaign. And they take the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and they subordinate it to the Russian Orthodox Church. They're going to turn all these Ukrainians into Russians. And Shevchenko says, no, we are not Russian. We are Ukrainian. We have our own language, our own literature, our own history, our own heroes. And I will remind you over and over and over again of the difference. I cannot tell you what a powerful influence Shevchenko and other writers were in creating what we call Ukrainian self-awareness or Ukrainian nationalism. By the end of the 19th century, there were millions and millions of people living in the Ukraine who were part of the Russian Empire who simply didn't accept what the Russian government was telling them. They're not Russian who speak bad Russian. They are Ukrainians, and they're proud to be Ukrainians. It would be as though black English would turn into a what? No, it's its own language, and they would find a Shakespeare using black English, and then after a while, people, no, you're not speaking English. What do you mean? That's our what? That's our language. So, Ukrainian strength is there, and then comes the opportunity for independence. That opportunity was triggered by a war. That war is the First World War. And in the first...
On the big highway of life, there's only one safe place for kids.
Backseat, baby.
The front seat's not the place to drop off. Don't want that big old bag to pop up.
Backseat, baby.
Put that booties in the backseat now.
Backseat, baby.
Have that some kids you never meet. I'm here to remind you to put them behind you.
Backseat, baby.
Wow! Look at here.
Backseat, baby.
To stay alive even when I drive.
And in the First World War, the Russians go to war with Germany and Austria. And the German armies move into the Russian Empire. Ultimately, they will enter the Ukraine. They will penetrate so far that the Russian government collapses, the Tsar abdicates. in 1917, and when he abdicates, the chaos breaks out. And in fact, a group of Ukrainians in Kiev in 1917 put up a flag and announce what? That Ukraine is an independent country. No sooner do they do that, the German army arrives. And the German army says, fine, you want to have a Ukraine? That's great. Anything that takes anything away from Russia is good for us. Only you're going to have to what? Obey us. But then the Germans lose the war, and the German army withdraws, and the Russians experience a revolution, which we call the Communist or Bolshevik Revolution, and there's chaos. The German army is moving back, the Red Army is trying to move in, and in between are the Ukrainians. And for 2 years, between 1918 and 1920, they establish the first independent Ukrainian state. Their capital is Kiev. And they make a flag, which is still the flag, by the way. It was the flag of the Ukraine. It has blue and yellow. So there's the two colors, blue and yellow. And they have their own currency. They dropped the ruble. And the name of their currency, in Russian, it would have been called grivnia, which always sounded to me like baked fat in Yiddish, but it's all right. Grivnia, but you don't say g, you say ch, so it's hrivnia, it's the hrivnia, all right. So the hrivnia, when I first went to the Ukraine and they kept handing me, hrivnias, I was wondering but whatever. That's the name of the currency. And the name goes all the way back to 1918, and they had a very powerful leader who organized a Ukrainian army. His name was Petlura. And he said, "We are not Russian. We are Ukrainian and we will be independent. But I do want to tell you, it didn't last. The Bolshevik army pulled itself together, and now it was very clear. The Bolsheviks wanted the Black Sea ports, and they wanted the fertile land of the Ukraine, and they thought of it as part of Russia. So the Bolshevik army came into the Ukraine. They defeated Petlura, and the Ukrainians fell again under the control of the Russians. By 1921, the first Ukrainian republic is over. In 1921, however, the Russians are communists. Communists never rule other people, do they? They believe in democracy, don't they? So what Stalin created is something called the Soviet Union, which is really the Russian Empire. But he designed it differently. He said, every nation in the Russian Empire, every nation is independent. And they have all voluntarily come together into a union. Do you understand? Called the Soviet Union. So, the Georgian people can have their own country, called Georgia, but it's part of the what? The Soviet Union. And the Kazakh people can have what? Their own republic, but it's part of the Soviet Union. And the Ukrainians can have one too. I mean, the only problem was that the Ukrainian government had no power. All decisions were made by Stalin. And when somebody came to Stalin and said, you've just recreated the Russian Empire. I mean, you control the Ukraine. He said, not me. He said, we've created a Ukrainian republic. Don't you see that? It's got a government. There's a palace in Kiev. It's got its own president. It's true he calls me every half hour, but that isn't, no, do you understand? He's really, so we honor the Ukraine. Not only that, we will cultivate Ukrainian folk dancing and send the troops to Detroit. Remember them? They used to come. They used to be on the Masonic Temple stage, and they would sing Ukrainian songs, and they would do Ukrainian dances. And if you asked them, they would say, "Oh, the Ukrainian people are free people in the Soviet Union. You understand that we're free, 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 free." It's not like the old Tsarist times, except that the Ukraine was not free. It was under the control of the Russians. And what the Russians did was they sent thousands of Russians into the Ukraine, and they insisted on the use of the Russian language. So when I first went to Kiev, which was 1970, interesting experience, I asked, what language is used in the elementary school? Ukrainian. What language is used in the high school? This is the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Russian. What is the language at the University of Kiev? Russian. So the signals are very clear. If you want to get along in the Soviet Ukraine, speaking Ukrainian is absolutely useless. In fact, during the Soviet period, thousands and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians forgot how to speak Ukrainian. I mean, they just spoke Russian because that was the language. So no matter what Stalin and the people who followed him said, the policy of the Russian government was to turn Ukrainians into Russians. And they would have succeeded had the economy worked. But we know the economy didn't work. Terrible things were done by the communists in the Ukraine. The Ukraine had a whole group of this fertile land of prosperous farmers. They're called kulaks. And in 1930, Stalin decided to take away their land and to collectivize all the agriculture. And they offered resistance. So he did two things to them. Either he took all their food and gave them no food and they starved to death, or he killed them. It is estimated that up to 10 million Ukrainians died in the forced collectivization under Stalin. If you want to call that an independent Ukraine, I mean, you can call it an independent Ukraine. I mean, it was terrible. During World War II, the Germans came back. The Ukrainians were so mad, the Germans had an opportunity to turn the Ukrainians against the Russians. They tried. In fact, they did recruit some Ukrainians to work for them in concentration camps and whatever it was, but they made a mistake. They were stupid racists. They told the Ukrainians that the Germans were the superior race and that Ukrainian Slavs were supposed to work for them. Dumb! The net result was that the Ukrainians never supported the Germans in the way the Germans wanted to be supported, and in fact, when the war was over, there were thousands of Ukrainian guerrillas who had been fighting in the forest against the Germans. And now that the war was over, they turned their energies against the Russians. It's called the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. And it took 5 years before the Russians were able to subdue the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Recently, the Ukrainian government honored this army. And Putin sent a message saying, the Russian people are outraged. Well, in addition, the whole economy is falling apart. And Gorbachev shows up. And the Soviet Union is now reeling so badly that in August of 1991, The army, hating Gorbachev, stages a coup. They arrest him. They want to restore the old law and order, but it's too late. Boris Yeltsin then gets up and dissolves the Soviet Union. And in a flash, he says to the Ukrainians, "You're free." I mean, there were no demonstrations. You're free. So in August or September of 1991, there emerges the second, independent Ukrainian republic. So now let me try to describe the challenges faced by this republic. First of all, the Ukrainian people getting rid of communism and hearing what's going on in the West, how people live so well. They didn't know that the electricity goes out on a... No, the people are living so well. They're expecting what? They're now independent, and America's going to come and what? Raise their standard of living and the whole thing. It's going to be great. However, meeting those expectations, given the condition of the Ukraine, it's like ludicrous. The second was that Ukraine was industrialized by the Russians. The eastern part of the Ukraine, because there's coal there and iron. But the things that they manufactured, you could sell to the Soviet Union. But you couldn't sell it on the world market. On the world market, it was called junk. So that meant that if you're independent now and you're on your own, you've got to sell your products all around. You have nothing to sell. Other than that, no problem. Okay, fine. The third is the Russians had placed atomic weapons, right, in the Ukraine. It was part of the Soviet Union. There are several thousand significant atomic weapons. What do you do with them? If the Ukraine had wanted to, it could turn itself into a major atomic power state. But it didn't have the resources to do that. So what do you do with it? The fourth challenge was the major naval bases of the Russians are not in Russia. It's all freezing up there. It's all down here. The major naval base of the Russians is in the Crimea, in the Ukraine. It's called Sevastopol. We used to call it Sebastopol, is what we say in English. And it's a major, major Russian naval base. The huge Russian fleet, most of it is down there in the Ukraine. So does that fleet belong to the Ukrainians? Or does it belong to the Russians? The next problem was the Ukraine for 75 years has an ideology. It's called communism. Religion is suppressed. And now, no communism. So what is the uniting ideology? In America, we have a kind of uniting ideology, built around the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. So what? Communism has collapsed. The next issue is, because they're all screaming at them from America, you've got to privatize. You've got to have private property. Everything in the Ukraine is owned by the state. That's why it's a problem. So how do you privatize? Nobody in the Ukraine has any money to buy anything. Do you sell everything in the Ukraine to foreigners? How do you do it? How do you privatize? All of a sudden, I have all the state industry. And I'd like to keep it under Ukrainian ownership. And nobody has that. What? Anything to pay. They're all poor for this. So how do you privatize? Next was the currency. Do we keep the ruble, or do we create something else? I already gave you the answer to that. It's called the what? The grivna. The grivnia or the hrivnia. All right, fine. And Then comes religion. Religion was outlawed for all practical purposes. But now religion was part of historic Ukrainian nationalism. What do we champion? The Orthodox Ukrainians say orthodoxy. The Catholic Ukrainians say what? Catholicism. And now a war breaks out between the what? The Catholics and the Orthodox. And then a major challenge is, how do we persuade the United States of America to send over billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars to what? To build and rescue our economy. Aren't they the richest nation in the world? Well, and then, how do we deal with Russia? Once they recover from what Yeltsin did, and they realize they've given us up, won't they want us back? And then, of course, came the challenge that, of course, was part of the election. In the western Ukraine, most of the people still speak Ukrainian. In the eastern Ukraine, where Russian influence was the strongest, in some areas, 60 to 70% of the people are Russian. Do they want to belong to the Ukraine? And in fact, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Ukrainians in the eastern Ukraine no longer speak Ukrainian, they speak Russian. So if we're trying to reorient Ukraine to the West and separate ourselves from Russia, what will these people say? So I want to tell you, in 1991, the Ukrainian government woke up with an enormous headache. Do you see, do you feel the proportions of this headache? And after the break, what I want to tell you is what they took for the headache. Thank you, and enjoy the break. When the Ukraine became independent in September of 1991, it had a communist ruler whose name was Kravchuk. He was a replacement for a man who had fought Gorbachev, and Gorbachev got rid of him, Sherwin, who was a Stalinist and an old follower of Brezhnev and so forth. So Kravchuk was fairly new, but he was a dyed-in-the-wool apparatchik, member of the Communist Party, and the next thing he knows, he's in charge of this country. So what he decides to do is to say, I'm no longer a communist. Oh, well, that's good. And all the people in my government are no longer communists. Oh, well, that's nice to know. So we'll change our name. We'll call ourselves Social Democrats. So when the independence came, the same crew that was in charge before changes its name and stays in power. I first came, I was in the Ukraine during the communist era, but my first trip to the Ukraine after independence was in the Kravchuk period, and what Kravchuk decided to do, because he was a communist in his thinking, was not to do what Yeltsin tried to do, which is to privatize industry. He simply said, we're going to keep industry under the control of the state. But your industry is what? Falling apart. The things it produces nobody wants, do you understand? And it needs investment money which you don't have. But he felt that if he made any great change in the economy, he would lose his job. If he keeps everything the what? The same. So when I first arrived in the Ukraine, I was told communism had collapsed. No. But it was like the Ukraine under communism. There were no private stores. Now, they have something called bakery. Groceries, basic groceries. I mean, it was the whole thing. Nothing changed. And what they now had was a new currency. The first name of the currency, no self-respecting country would choose this name. I'm going to give the name to you. Before they got hryvnia, while they were working up hryvnia, they called it coupon. If somebody gave you a currency called coupon, I said to the bank, the teller, you can't call it coupon. It was called coupon. I mean, and not only that, I threw in $1 and I rupture-sized numbers of coupons because what had set in was inflation. What Kravchuk decided to do to solve the problem of payment, for instance, if you are a pensioner, you're supposed to get a pension from the state. But the state doesn't have any money because it isn't selling anything out there. So what they do is they pay you the same amount of money, only they print so much money now, the money you're getting is worthless. In fact, the people in Lviv and in Kiev and Odessa were worse off than they were under the communists because now their money was, they didn't have the ruble, and whatever this coupon was worthless. And they were wandering around saying, what happened? Under Kravchuk, the gross national product of the Ukraine fell by 50%. You got it? Fell by 51. The rest of the world is what? Growing, expanding. It's the 1990s, the whole thing. The Ukraine is shrinking. Russia shrank, but not 50%. So the levels of unemployment were absolutely extraordinary. And some of the poverty I saw, this was 1991, 1992, 1993, and 1994, the poverty I saw could remind you of a third world country. You crossed over from Poland like a third world country. In the Kravchuk period, the Ukrainians were so desperate. They needed some kind of currency. They needed some kind of goods. They would try to cross the border to Poland. They thought Poland was like America. We would arrive in Poland and think we were in a third world country. They thought they were going to America, and they would line up at the border to get across the border to sell their junk. There was a whole market in Warsaw on the east side of the river where all the Ukrainians are around selling their, you want to call it a flea market, that's to dignify what it was. And in fact, the party remained. It was simply what? Renamed. The policy and the economy remained. In fact, the Ukraine failed to do or what the Russians did. They got Jeff Saxon from Harvard and the whole thing, and they tried to privatize, and they made mistakes along the way, but at least there was movement and dynamism. It was like no change, and the levels of corruption, since whatever you're paid is worthless, people who were in public office try to make money by what? Extract, I mean, there are things that are worthwhile. Jewelry, other things. You can bribe people with things that have substance. I want to tell you that if I were Ukrainian at that time, I wouldn't be sure that getting independence was such a wonderful thing. In fact, in the East Ukraine, there were major strikes in the mines, the coal mines. They came out, major strikes against the government. I mean, they weren't getting paid. If they were getting paid, they were getting paid in coupons. So then, by 1992 or 93, there is a kind of public pressure. Something's got to be done. And in fact, American advisors arrive and say the following. If you'll get rid of Kravchuk, and if you'll try a few experiments, and if you'll make some changes, we'll give you some money. Oh. That led to what we call a reform movement. The reform movement was led by the man who still is the president of the Ukraine until Yushchenko is inaugurated. His name is Leonid Kuchma, and he presented himself as a reformer. And he said, what I'm going to do, he says, is I'm going to reform the economy, I'm going to privatize the economy, I'm going to provide for private property, I'm going to get rid of this old party, I don't care, they've renamed themselves, get rid of those people, and we're going to please the Americans. Oh. And so the Americans say, Kuchma, that's great. So Kuchma becomes a prime minister under Kravchuk in 1992, but in 1994 he runs for president under this reform ticket. All right? And he wins. Overwhelmingly, he is the star. He is now in charge, and he then begins, he starts out in 1994 and 95, things, we're going to privatize, sell off the state assets, try to get foreign money to invest in it and whatever. We're going to do that. All right, so he starts that process. However, after a few months, he realizes that this change will be very painful. So now let me give you the example. Poland, who was also advised by Jeffrey Sachs from Harvard, who was the son of a well-known lawyer in this town. His name was Ted Sachs. He was a labor lawyer. So Jeffrey Sachs advised the Poles, he said, what you're going to have to do, otherwise it's not going to work, you're going to have to plunge. You're going to have to chatter, and it's going to be so cold your teeth are going to shatter, or whatever. And the